Hello and welcome, and thank you for being here. This video is going to talk about energy system development and what that means and what the relevant implications are for your training. If you do not know me already, my name is Gregory. I hold a bachelor's in exercise physiology, current student of physical therapy, among other certifications here and there. I have been coaching people either remotely or in person for about 6 or 7 years now. I've done some form of concurrent or hybrid training for the greater part of my life, and I say that to say that I think good information, especially in this regard, comes from the intersection of experience with others, experience with oneself, and some form of formal education, which is what I hope to bring you with all of my free content here. Now, to develop your energy systems, to me, is really what it means to perform conditioning training. And whenever you're thinking about that side of your training, this is one of the primary things that should be guiding how you structure different training sessions. So the goal of this video is to talk about the energy systems from a standpoint of what is important to know for your training. Now, there's a lot that can be said on the sciencey side of things in this regard, but my intention is to keep this only relevant to, what matters for training. So with that said, and before we start talking about some of the other stuff that's going to be in this video, this is what I thought would be a good little bit of prerequisite knowledge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. So ATP, you may or may not know about it. It is the molecule that supplies all of the energy within our body. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, meaning that an adenosine molecule is holding 3 triphosphate groups. When one of those phosphate groups is released, it becomes adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphates, and energy is released. And that release of energy is what fuels all of the processes within your body. There's only about 100 grams of ATP stored in your body at any given point. That's kind of constantly being used. And so the goal of all of your energy systems is to replenish that ATP as it is used to make sure that there is still energy being provided over time. There are 3 main ways that your body replenishes this ATP as it is broken down and used for either movement or anything else. And those are the creatine phosphate system, fast glycolytic system, and the oxidative system, or the Krebs cycle oxidative phosphorylation. We'll just call that the oxidative system from here on out. Now, again, there's a lot that can be said about, how these interweave and the interplay among one another. But for the purposes of this video, it's simple enough to just assume that they are 3 distinct energy systems, and that when you are training them, that you're training one at a time. And as I denote here, the way that they differ is 1, how quickly they can produce energy, how much energy they can produce, and how fatigable they are, meaning like how long can they last, in other words. And these are important distinctions because there are some activities where you might need energy now, but you might not need it for a long period of time or a lot of it. Say, for example, a heavy squat. Or you might not need energy super quickly or a lot of it super quickly, but you might need it to be produced for a long period of time, say a 60-minute run. So in line with that, when you're programming to target a different energy system in a different workout or a different training, the primary things you're going to be programming around are intensity of movement and duration of movement, and really more so intensity, because duration is just going to be a byproduct of the given intensity. And what I mean by that will become more clear as we kind of go through each individual one. So before we start talking about them individually, this is another little piece of prerequisite knowledge that I thought would be helpful just to make everything else a bit more practical. Now, program design and designing a workout is as much of an art as it is a science, and there are numerous different reasons why you might choose one exercise over the other. The overall goal of the programming, being the primary reason. Nevertheless, if the goal of a workout is specifically and solely to target and develop a specific energy system, then not all modes of exercise selection are created equal. For instance, if you imagine a workout where you're doing squats, push-ups, and pull-ups in a circuit with no rest, and you're doing that for the purpose of building an energy system, then you're going to be ineffective in your pursuit, because there are many other factors, such as just force production of your muscles, that might be the limiting factor. And again, I say this a lot, but the limiting factor of any given movement is what is being trained. And so if you want to optimize for training any aspect of your fitness, you need to remove everything else as the limiting factor and let the thing to be trained be the limiting factor. Some general things that might make a mode of exercise not ideal for energy system development include large ranges of motion. So if you imagine like a squat, that's full range of motion. Eccentric loading, again, the squats, pull-ups, and push-ups going to have eccentric loading, and impact. And again, this is very general. I wouldn't see these as hard rules, and I would look at this as more of a spectrum. Like the larger the range of motion, probably the the less ideal. The more eccentric loading, perhaps the less ideal. The more impact, perhaps the less ideal. But that does not mean that an exercise cannot have any of these in order to be good. It can have some degree of these. It's just these, maximizing these are what is going to make a mode of exercise selection not ideal. So looking at this list here to illustrate what I mean by that, cycling is probably the best example of having none of these, in the fact that there is not a large range of motion, there's not a lot of eccentric loading, and there's no impact. So you for the most part can, as much as possible, just focus on the conditioning aspect. Running is going to have some impact and some eccentric loading, albeit not as much impact as plyometrics or not as much eccentric loading as, squats. And force production, for the most part is never going to be the limiting factor for running, save for a few special instances, but nevertheless. Swimming and skiing, again, pretty large range of motion, but no eccentric loading and no impact. So again, this is my personal list if I'm going to try to target an energy system and I'm training for the purpose of conditioning, or if I'm running a program for the purpose of conditioning. And if you seek to do so, then this would be my recommendation as well. So now let's start talking about the energy systems more specifically. Now, again, the first one we're going to talk about is the creatine phosphate system. Like we said, these systems vary in regard to how fast they can produce energy, how fatigable they are, and how much energy they can produce. Creatine is notable because of its ability to produce energy the fastest, but it cannot produce a lot of energy, and it cannot do so for very long. Most sources will say that this, energy system is predominant in activities in which you fatigue somewhere between 5 to 30 seconds. Now, again, this is going to vary depending on source and probably depending on person, but somewhere in that ballpark is what you should, understand. Now, again, to be clear, this does not mean any activity lasting 5 to 30 seconds. This is any activity in which you hit fatigue within 5 to 30 seconds. So think max effort within that period of time. In regard to training this energy system, typically recommend people approach this just the way you would approach any other bout of strength training, whether it's a squat or a bicep curl, in terms of how you program it. So I put two examples here. So, an easy example would be 2 to 3 seconds of max effort for 10 seconds on an air dyne with about 3 minutes of rest. Another example using different sort of parameters would just be to do a 100-meter dash for time. For most people, that's going to take somewhere between 10 to, let's say 20 seconds, depending on the person, which again, if you're doing that for max effort, is going to easily fall within that sort of, programmed time duration. This energy system is what creatine monohydrate supplementation specifically benefits. I do have a whole other article video explaining, that supplementation, which I will link down below if you are interested. Now, the next one is fast glycolysis. And this is sort of the next step up from creatine, the creatine phosphate system, in the sense that it produces a little bit more energy, produces it a little more slowly, but can last also a little longer. Typically, this energy system is the predominant system in activity in which you are hitting fatigue between 30 seconds and 3 minutes. And again, varies depending on source and probably person to person, but somewhere within that time period. In regard to training this energy system, there are two approaches that I typically take, which are straight sets or intervals. So an example of doing straight sets would be similar to how we talked about, creatine or any other, set of strength training. So you would do 2 to 3 sets of 2 minutes at, let's say 7 to 10 effort on a ski erg or any of the aforementioned exercise modalities that we listed previously, with about 3 minutes rest in between sets. And again, 2 to 3 sets of that. And part of the reason why I say 7 to 10 out of 10 effort on this is because if you're doing a 2-minute all-out bout and you go 10 out of 10 effort from the start, you might burn out 30 seconds in. So typically it's best practice to start at a more like 7 out of 10 effort and progress to a 10 out of 10 effort towards the end. But nevertheless, I hope that kind of gives you a bit more of an idea of what I mean by that. As far as intervals are concerned, for the specific purpose of developing the fast glycolytic system, this is my preferred means of structuring it. So say you're on a treadmill, you would do 2 minutes at a 5 out of 10 effort, 2 minutes at a 9 out of 10 effort, repeat that 3 to 5 times with no rest in between. And again, that can be done on any of the modes of exercise that are listed previously. And there are different reasons why you might choose the straight set approach versus the interval approach. That's a bit, I would say, beyond the scope of this video. I will make more content on each one of these in the future, going into why you might choose one path or the other. And again, I'm putting efforts here, subjective efforts instead of pace, because obviously, appropriate pacing is going to be different person to person. But I hope that kind of, gives you a bit of the idea of what I mean by this. And there are 2 supplements that are going to specifically benefit this energy system, and that is beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate. I do have an article and video on beta-alanine and just an article on sodium bicarbonate. I will link those down below if you are interested in seeing what those have to say. And the last one is the oxidative system, which produces by far the most energy, lasts the longest, and produces energy the slowest. This energy system fuels almost all of the normal functionings of our body, like your heart beating, your breathing, stuff like that. And it fuels most things you might consider endurance, like long distance running. This energy system, as I denote here, is the one that you might consider synonymous with cardio, because it is going to also, if you're training the oxidative system, you are also training your cardiovascular system at large. And for the purposes of this video, you can assume that this is the predominant energy system in which you are doing activities that last longer than 3 minutes. And in this case, you can assume just activity in which you're doing that's longer than 3 minutes, in which you don't hit fatigue, or in which you do hit fatigue. So to give you an example, if you were to do a 10-minute run all out for max distance, that is going to be predominantly fueled by the oxidative system. Similarly, if you were going to do a 60-minute run at, let's say, 65% max heart rate, you're probably not going to hit true fatigue in the sense that you're wanting to keel over and throw up, but it's still going to be predominantly fueled by the oxidative system. It's also worth adding that the rest and recovery in between sets of training and in between sessions of training, so if we go back to the straight sets of the fast glycolysis system, the creatine phosphate system, or in between sets of strength training, the recovery is fueled by the oxidative system. There are three main ways that I typically program around training this energy system specifically. There is the high volume, low intensity, in which the high volume is the focus. There is tempo meaning that something like the 10-minute all-out run would be an example of a tempo run. And then intervals, in which the hard bout of the interval is lasting longer than 3 minutes. Now, how you structure these throughout a week is a rabbit hole in and of itself. And again, I will make further content on each one of these systems specifically. But something to note is that the high volume, low intensity work is probably the most important piece to this puzzle. And to be clear, it's not necessarily the low intensity aspect of it. It is doing the high volumes of work that is going to derive the benefit. And that is kind of the idea behind the whole push behind zone 2 training these days across social media and whatnot. So I wanted to finish this video up just kind of talking about some general thought processes about how you might program these all together within a given week. Now, that I don't necessarily think you need to add all of these different means of training in every block of training that you do. You can cycle them in and out depending on what your current goals are, what time of year it is, etc. But just for the sake of practicality, let's imagine you wanted to program all of these means of training within a single given week. Now, the creatine phosphate system is very easily combined with any other form of strength or hypertrophy training. And that's because the creatine phosphate system is also what's fueling those means of training. So, for example, you might go to do a full body workout on a given day. You might start that full body workout with 3 sets of 10-second sprints on the air dime, and then move on to do hypertrophy work for the remainder of the session. And that would make a very easy way to just, add in a little bit of creatine phosphate programming into any sort of strength regime. In regard to high intensity fast glycolytic or oxidative programming, I typically only recommend programming that about once a week. And that's because that is some of the most stressful and intense and recovery demanding sort of training that you might impose on your body. And for the most part, if you're doing that type of training multiple times per week, then you're probably never recovering enough to reach sufficient intensity in any one of those sessions. So doing high intensity fast glycolytic or oxidative programming just once a week is my typical recommendation for that reason. And to be clear, that means any sort of training in which you are going max effort, high intensity to fatigue, in which these two systems of energy are the limiting factor. So that could mean intervals with 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on for the fast glycolytic programming. That could mean intervals with 4 minutes off, 4 minutes on for the oxidative interval programming. Or it can mean the straight sets of either, whether that's a tempo run oxidatively or a couple sets of 2 minutes all out with 3+ minutes of rest in between for the fast glycolytic programming. Something else to add about intervals and straight sets of high intensity fast glycolytic or oxidative programming is that you don't necessarily need to choose only one in a given training session. You can get a bit creative with how you structure it. So for instance, let's say you're going to do a interval workout, and let's say you're going to do 4 intervals in which there are 4 hard intervals. You might do the first 2 intervals, hard intervals of those, at a fast glycolytic sort of setting, and then do the second 2, the last 2, at a bit more of an oxidative setting. So you could do the first 2 intervals at 2 minutes all-out effort, and the last 2 intervals at a 4-minute all-out effort. The reasons why you would do one or the other or both really depend on the person and the goals and what you seek to accomplish. But nevertheless, I just wanted to say that's not just to say you shouldn't box yourself into choosing one or the other. If you are in a phase where it is beneficial to do both, then do both. It's no big deal. As far as low intensity oxidative programming, again, that's really a sort of case where the more is the better. Or the more of that your schedule allows you to reasonably commit to, probably the better off you're going to be. The only thing I'm going to say there is that it probably shouldn't be combined with any form of high intensity training, whether that's high intensity conditioning or strength training, to see best results long term. And to be clear, you can absolutely do low intensity training and high intensity training in the same program. Me and almost all of my clients have about a 50-50 split between, endurance and strength training. It's just that each individual session should have a clear distinction in terms of what your goal with that session is. So with that said, I'm going to end this video here. I hope you found that somewhat helpful or interesting, and I hope that guides you to train a bit more intelligently with your conditioning. Any sort of comments, questions, concerns, anything like that, you're welcome to comment below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And I will see you next time. Have a good one.